Hi, I'm Ethan Wong, and today I'm here speaking with Jacob Boyd. And we'll just get straight into the questions. So, something I ask everyone that comes on here basically is what's special about poetry in that you could pursue any other medium, creative medium, whether that's art or other forms of writing? Why poetry, I guess?
I think for me, it's the emphasis on metaphor foremost that draws me to it, and imagination, the role that metaphor plays in imagination, I guess. Poetry seems to me more than other types of writing to be able to hold contradictory ideas in one place, to present really the complicated nature of reality, I guess, in a way that is not as problematic as it can be in storytelling or nonfiction, which isn't to say that they don't do it there as well. I think that's what good writing typically does. But I feel like poetry, there's not as much of a burden to work things out, to sort things out, to choose sides, so to speak, in poetry. And we're able to evoke portraits of complicated life through poems, and moments, images, in ways that I really appreciate. So I guess that's it. But like on a more elementary, simple level answer, I think what initially drew me to it was the music, the rhythm, and the sounds, since that's something that is probably there from my earliest reading experiences and being read to.
Yeah. Hear a lot of people talk about kind of the melody of poetry really being a big drawing factor, especially at first glance when you get into the form. But I actually wanted to kind of explore what you're talking about earlier about, so if I'm not mistaken, what you're kind of saying is that there seems to be less of a burden to choose sides when you're depicting an issue with or depicting the world with poetry, and you can kind of more elegantly display all kind of elements of the issue. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, that is what I'm saying. I don't know how true that is, but I feel like when people read fiction, they want answers. They want to understand um, the situation, what angle the author's coming from. And of course, like I said, good authors will resist easy categorizations of their characters and situations like that. But I almost feel like one of the blessings of poetry is that readers come to the page not expecting those kinds of answers and preconceived notions about the world, but rather expecting to be surprised and to be led into wonder.
Yeah, I think there's a huge part of that. And I totally agree because sometimes when I sit down to read a poem, I kind of sit there just totally blank mind and I'm thinking, I don't even want anything from this poem. I just kind of want to experience it, like let it happen to me, you know? And I think that's a big thing that happens in poetry that doesn't necessarily, you can't necessarily find the same, or maybe it's just me, but you just doesn't feel like you can find the same thing in other forms of fiction or in other forms of art. Sometimes you kind of have, if not set expectations, you have ideas. And poetry sometimes feels like you can just totally let go of all of that sometimes.
I think I've always really liked that mind frame, that from a reading perspective too, of there's something very comfortable about that. And the reward with poetry is that you only have to read a page sometimes. You know, you can sit down with that blank, expectant, or not expectant, but open mind, and find some sort of reward or surprise within 30 lines.
Yeah.
I totally agree with you.
And actually, I'm asking this partly, uh, and this makes it sound more malicious than it actually is, but like I say for my own benefit, but it's because I was like holding a poetry workshop the other day, and then one of the people there was just sitting there kind of like blankly looking at their page and then looking at me kind of embarrassed. And I was like, what's wrong? Do you need more time or what, or you're done or what is it? And then they said, I can't write poetry. And I was like, well, I don't really, at that moment, I was kind of shocked because I was thinking, well, I'm not in my head, right? I'm thinking, I'm not asking you to write poetry. I'm asking you to write whatever you want. And I think there's a disconnect here between like, how do we tell people what poetry is in a way that is not like so inaccessible to them? Because I feel like a lot of people still think that way, even when I'm like explicitly telling them, oh yeah, it's not just that. You can do whatever you want in it.
Right, right. And how often do we also hear, I can't read poetry, I don't get poetry, you know, like
Yeah.
way more often even than I can't write it, but it's coming from the same place, I think. I guess that's the other side of the coin, where you can appreciate the ability or tendency of poetry to just sort of present the world in all of its complication without sorting things out. That also frustrates a lot of readers and thinks and makes some people maybe feel like there's an expectation there to either say everything or just to say things that are deeper than they have access to, which sucks, because it's, like you said, it's not true. When you sit down to write a poem, you're not sitting down to write the great poem. You're trying to express something, or maybe you're just trying to riff on a musical line that you like, or sort of focus on a fascinating image or a memory.
Yeah, I think it's so important to, and I'm still developing my strategy on this, but just kind of figure out how to let people know that it's like poetry is separate from poetry, like these are two different concepts. And when it's just like what you said, like poetry is not that deep to be anyone who writes a poem is trying to create the great work. It's more just a lot of people write poetry just because they feel it or somehow get that inspiration. And so even if it's not the great work in your head, you can just write about whatever you want. Like some people just do that and it's totally fine.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And kind of branching off of that, actually, I wanted to ask about your experience personally with kind of getting that inspiration for writing poetry. You already mentioned like riffing off of a musical line or stuff. And I know that this question is it pops up a lot, but I think it's insightful in that it kind of tells us about, well, here are all the different ways people get inspiration, right? So I wanted to ask, what do you think are the main sources of inspiration for, like, what really spurs you into a poem, whether that's like something that builds up or that's something like there's a moment that happens that gets you to do it?
I think ideally, it's the latter, that there are highly charged moments of our lives where a lot of things that have been building up maybe in our emotional, psychological makeup come to the fore somehow, or are given sudden concrete existence by something someone said or something that happened, things that come together in the world. But like I said, ideally, most poets that you talk to will say, occasionally there comes a poem that just sort of spills out, that just sort of they sat down to write it and they're just trying to get what actually happened or what their thoughts are down on the page, and that's how it is, and they hardly changed a word from the first time they wrote it to when they published it or whatever. Those types of poems, I think, are what really keep us coming back, or at least are a large part of what keep us coming back. I think that those moments, not always epiphanies, but they can be like epiphanies. They can be, it's just very rewarding, I think, to have anything in life come easy. You know,
Yeah.
it's not common or free. On the other hand, though, like what draws me to write almost daily is that I've found real joy in the process, in trying to make a thing sort of come alive, to give it fullness, whether that be, you know, I have a title and I want to see if I can complicate it or give it body somehow, or if I have a line or two lines or an image or a memory, and I want to see how I can play with those, I guess. And usually there's a desire to present whatever words or images I'm playing with in a way that goes beyond nostalgia and sentimentality and any sort of simple presentation, so that maybe I can see a bigger picture at play.
Yeah. And kind of on the thread of that bigger picture, do you ever like, what do you, or how do you kind of navigate the space that is kind of between stories and poetry? Because a lot of poetry can be kind of very scene based, as in it's like a certain event or like a certain scene or place, right? But how do you kind of navigate the space between tying that into a story and then still keeping that poetic aspect to it?
That's such a hard question, Ethan. I love poems of story and poems without story. You know, I like both kinds, and I especially like poems that do both things. I teach Gregory Orr's essay, The Four Temperaments, quite a bit. Are you familiar with this essay, The
No, I
Four
haven't heard
Temperaments
of it.
of Poetry? So, just like real briefly, his idea is that poets write out of four basic temperaments, and those are music, imagination, story, and structure. And he says music and imagination are limitless temperaments, and story and structure are more limiting or reining in temperaments. And he talks about how a great poem will have all four temperaments at play somehow or another. And merely a good poem needs to have one of the limitless temperaments and one of the limiting temperaments. So there needs to be a sort of balance between maybe story and imagination, or structure and music, as in like maybe most good villanelles. Now, I wouldn't say that I like am thinking about this essay and these temperaments when I'm writing, but it's something that I've tried to digest over the years, and I do, like I said, teach it. So occasionally when I'm revising or trying to extend a poem or develop it, I'm thinking about that balance, but it's more along the lines of, I think I'm aware if I've started to tell a story in a poem, whether or not that story needs to be developed, or maybe it just needs to come out. I've tried to work on the temperament of story in my writing a lot over the last 10 years or so, because I don't think it was one of my strengths to start out with. but it's something that I, like I said, I really love in poems.
Yeah. I think for me, it's been kind of a hard balance to strike sometimes because at the same time, I want to keep all the elements of my poetry that are there when I'm kind of just describing the scene or just describing this idea. But then but when I get into writing more of a story, it can get kind of listy in the sense that it kind of just ends up being like, oh, it becomes kind of bare bones because it's just the plot points of the story almost lining themselves up. And I kind of am still struggling with figuring out, like myself, how to meld those two elements together and keep them kind of cohesive.
Yeah, and there are so many ways to do it, and so many different poets that do it. I'm really drawn to poems that appear to do nothing but tell a story. Like there doesn't seem to be any sort of poetic voice
Mm,
kicking in, and maybe there's no metaphor or even figurative language at play, but there's still something. You get the sense that there's still something else that the story adds up to. I'm not entirely sure that there's a difference between like a really good short in fiction and a poem that's operating in that same way.
yeah.
So just curious, what do you think is your like strongest temperament? If we have music, imagination, structure, and story.
Probably imagination. I think just like the ways I'm able to like describe scenes are the favorite part of my writing. Or when I like look back on poems that are like old, and I'll be like, oh, this is a terrible poem. But then I'll still like catch a line or two where I'm like, I like the way I was thinking, like I like the image this builds in my head still. Like I like the way this sounds almost. But I don't know if that's music or imagination. I'm not
I
sure about that.
often I often can't tell the difference between and I say I can't tell as if these are like real things. They're not. They're made up categories, right? But structure and music, I think in poetry especially can get really tangled. Um,
Yeah.
it's hard to it's interesting that Gregory Orr slotted one of those in the limitless category and one of those in the limiting category because they can almost seem like the exact same thing,
Yeah, that
music and
is
structure.
interesting. I'll have to check that out. Because I've never heard of that before, but it does sound very informative. And kind of, if we're ready, uh, you could go on to read the poem now.
Okay, sure. So this poem was written this summer after a trip to Yellowstone National Park, and is quite story driven. You'll be the first to hear it. No pressure on you. It's called Live Memorably. This is a little like watching nature on TV, he thought, sitting cross-legged on the gravel shoulder, listening first to a shy French child and her father teach Katie ours en peluche, then to a ranger saying, she's kind of an ideal mother, all while focusing the binoculars on a scruffy cinnamon black bear. She was busting open a rotting log and snuffling up grubs. Down from the lodgepole pine, where she had treed them to get a little time to herself, two cubs bumbled. They lived like any other bears. They had their routines, their indulgences, a pint of creamed huckleberry honey. Why was it important to live memorably? Whose memory? The cubs loved their mother's ways and would remember when the berries were where. Not much more mattered than that, nor needed remembering.
Thank you. That
You're
was
welcome.
great. I kind of, yeah, I see the way you're tying together like the story and the poem there. Kind of like there's definitely a balance that's being struck. And it's hard to describe, but I can feel it.
I hope so. I don't know if I have enough distance from it yet to sort of judge it at all myself, but I hope so. There's definitely a story being told. I'm not quite sure what else there is yet, though.
Well, I look
I
forward to
had
seeing.
fun. I had fun with this and a series of other poems this summer. The title is "Live Memorably," because I was just trying to write a poem based on each of these principles that I found online. There was this guy named John Perry Barlow, and he has a list of the 25 principles of adult behavior. And I decided just to try to take each one and write a poem with the principle as the title. So this principle was live memorably. And like I did in a lot of them, in this one, I think I'm trying to question why throughout, why we should live memorably, or what it means to live memorably, and how much stock I actually put in that as a principle of adulthood.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure.